The following program does not offer personal medical advice. Please consult your doctor before using any treatment or product we cover. Welcome to Go to Health Media with your host, Jonathan Marks. We provide a welcoming environment where experts educate you on important health topics, answer your questions, and provide information from which you can benefit in consultation with your doctor. You can visit and subscribe to the show at gotohealthmedia.com. And now, here is Jonathan Marks. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Go to Health. This is your host, Jonathan Marks. And as you all know, very sadly, on October 7th, 2023, southern Israel was attacked by Hamas fighters from the Gaza Strip, who hunted, tortured, and killed 1,200 individuals in what has been described as mining the depths of inhumanity. In addition, Hamas has taken and still holds about 240 hostages who were in southern Israel, aged from 9 months to over 80 years old, and from over 40 countries. The loss of Israeli life on October 7th is equivalent to the loss of life of 30,000 Americans on September 11th, 2001, when Al-Qaeda attacked the United States. We know the trauma Americans went through following that attack, but Israeli trauma is 10 times bigger. In addition to that, 300,000 Israeli reservists have been called to active duty in the Israel Defense Forces, which affects that many more Israeli families. And of course, as of recording, we now have the death toll of 12,000 Palestinian civilians in Gaza, half of which are children, according to Hamas's Ministry of Health, which adds to the trauma in the region. And we have the rise of anti-Semitism worldwide, which has threatened Jews throughout the world. My guest today is no stranger to working with trauma patients. As the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, she has devoted her 3-decade career to providing specialized treatment to survivors worldwide. Her experience spans diverse communities, including Iranian refugees, residents of the Colombia Palestinian refugee camp, and individuals from Arab, Druze, and Jewish Israeli backgrounds in the aftermath of war. She has also provided support to witnesses of the 9/11 attacks, and she is now treating individuals in Israel who are suffering from the October 7th massacre. Allow me to introduce Dr. Orli, PhD. She's a postdoc certified in clinical, social, and neuropsychology. In addition to her psychotherapy, her focus on neurofeedback and neuromodulation has resulted in what she refers to as accelerated trauma treatment. Welcome to the show, Dr. Petter. How are you today?
Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here, Jonathan.
We're glad to have you. So I want to get right to this. Can you describe for us what kind of trauma Israelis are suffering since the October 7th Hamas attack?
Well, the country is a very small country, and nearly everybody knows someone who has been impacted by the attack. And many know family or friends who've been injured or murdered, not just from the attack, but from what's going on in Gaza right now. So nearly everybody's affected. Mm-hmm. And this is very different than a regular PTSD event, because the P stands for post-trauma. And when a war is ongoing, it's a continuous trauma. So the nervous system doesn't have time to relax. So it's constantly under arousal and constantly has to be vigilant. Even while you're going about your day for the civilians, there still is a background vigilance going on, and the nervous system has to be ready on a hair trigger. In some neighborhoods in Israel, when the rockets go off either from Hamas in Gaza, or also they're coming down from Hezbollah in Lebanon, many of these villages, cities, towns may have just 15, 20 seconds to run to a bomb shelter. And some of these rockets may be happening multiple times a day.
Mhm.
So you need your nervous system to be easily triggered, unfortunately.
Mhm. And what does it mean for Israelis that the October 7th attack is the worst since the Holocaust? What special meaning does this have?
Now you're getting into the models that people form of the world around them, which is something that we have to deal with eventually in trauma treatment for the person to be completely functional again. Because in trauma, the model, most of the time, the model that you have of how the world is, how safe the world is ruptured. There's an injury to that. And the extent of that injury impacts the extent of how much treatment is going to be needed, basically. So this isn't often talked about, but if you look at international data, for instance, when we have people in the UN international armies that are trying to protect something and they're exposed to different amounts of traumas, some sort of violence, whether it's bombs or whatnot, you'll see that culturally there is a different rate of PTSD. And Americans usually have more than other countries. There are theories about it, and it's interesting because these theories started by non-American psychiatrists and specialists in trauma, that the worldview of Americans, we've been so sheltered, our country's so big, we don't often have attacks on our land. So we have a model of the world where it's safe, and or at least safer than most other people in the world. And so when that gets shattered by some sort of, not necessarily unexpected violence, someone, let's say, who's raised in Lebanon, who the bombs can be going off all the time, especially there was about a 15, 20-year period there where such fighting among the different groups there, even after the Civil War there. So since they expected it almost every moment, you never knew when you walked out the door what was going to happen. So they didn't have to revise their model of the world. But Americans have to do more of that. Mm-hmm. Historians talk about our generation, that we were living in a blip. And definitely, Israel less so because they were having wars. But this type of massacre was beyond what anybody ever even dreamed of.
The tragedy is just horrendous.
And when that goes beyond even the imagination, I mean, you expect the rockets when you're in Israel, especially if you're in the south of Israel. You learn how to cope with it. I visited many of the kibbutzim in the south and took a tour there, and they showed me the rockets and the balloons that would be fired from Hamas that would have a bomb in them. So when they'd land on a child could go up, and be attracted to it, and then it would explode. They lived with that level of caution, but the level of torture and sadism, torture beyond even what you'd expect torture to be, is devastating, and a tremendous job in evaluating humankind and what danger is actually lurking.
What does this event do for Holocaust survivors? It must be such a repeat of what happened back in the 40s.
Well, my father's a Holocaust survivor, and he's still alive. He's 95 now. He wasn't a baby when the Holocaust happened, so he actually has memories. He was between 11 and 17, and he's actually more robust. And this is something that we see in some of the Holocaust research, that a trauma can actually bifurcate people. People tend to only look at, and for a long time, the research only looked at the Holocaust survivors that went into treatment and extrapolated that to all Holocaust survivors. And so they had a much more negative view of what can happen because they only looked at that one group. But there's been other research that's kind of looked at both of the groups. And in some measures, the Holocaust survivors actually do better than someone who wasn't traumatized before. And some of those measures have to do with optimism and robustness.
Mhm.
And my father definitely is in that group.
Good.
So he, for him, it's sad. And it's sad to me that this may be the last part of his life that he has to see it ending the world like how his youth was.
Yes.
But by the same token, he feels like, well, now Israel has an army and there's a defense and there's not a helplessness.
Mhm.
So there's going to be a myriad of responses that people have, including Holocaust survivors, but that's one type of response.
Right.
In that case, he would be somebody that you might want to just hang out with because he's not as erratic in his responses.
Mhm. You just mentioned something that we have an Israeli army now, and this was different from him. But I've read in the press that a lot of Israelis, especially in the South where people were attacked, felt there was no army. They felt there was no protection. And it was particularly traumatic because there was no presence until hours after the attack. Can you talk more about what that does to the psyche?
I can in general. I don't know how true that was for every person. I know there was a delay, but one thing that increases the chances of getting a traumatic response is how helpless you feel.
Mhm.
And so if there's a helplessness, then that's going to be much more taxing to your nervous system for reasons that I won't go into right now.
Okay.
That can really cause a freeze state and make it harder to do treatment later and to help the person. Not that we can, it just makes it deeper.
The other question I have while we're on this topic is, since October 7th, we've seen a huge rise in anti-Semitism around the world. And I'm wondering if you have insight into what that's doing for Jewish people feeling unsafe or bringing up past trauma or creating new trauma. I've read again that students on college campuses are feeling traumatized from some of the ways they've been treated.
So that's where we get into the definition of trauma. There's, in the public for certain reasons, the word trauma means something different than it does clinically to us, to professionals who work in the field. In the public domain, people will use the word trauma for being nervous or scared or upset or having even tension and stress for a few weeks. But that's not technically trauma clinically. And so we do want to separate that. Jewish students and just Jews around the world, almost everybody is stressed, depressed, forlorn. I don't know anybody who I've spoken to, and I've spoken to probably over 100 people, that is not impacted in some way.
Higher levels of stress. And what else comes along with that?
Well, some people may have nightmares. They may have sleep problems. They, again, may be vigilant. They may get depressed. Those are all expected reactions given the severity of what's happened.
Right. Okay.
And even what's happening in the diaspora. It's a different kind of situation because in the diaspora, there's not the same protection. So even though the actual event may not be nearly as serious, like if a student gets beat up or witnesses being beat up or has to be barricaded in the library because of a scary mob outside, that's not the same, obviously, as the brutality of the massacre on October 7th. But there is a sense in Israel that there's a unification of people protecting you. I mean, you may have read that many of the Bedouins in the South, and the Arab Muslims, Christians, they all banded together. Some of them even lost their lives trying to help some of the people in the kibbutzim or at the Nova Music Festival. So there's a real unification there. They're not feeling danger from within very much.
So
Whereas the Jews, in the diaspora, it's the opposite. The event isn't as intense, but there's not a sense of security that the government or the police or even their neighbor is going to support them.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. So we've been talking with Dr. Orli Petter. She is a psychotherapist. She's a specialist in clinical psychology, social psychology, and neuropsychology. We've been talking about the Hamas attack on October 7th, and we're going to continue with Dr. Petter after this break. We'll be talking more about her practice in dealing with trauma and the effective methods. And then we'll also be talking about a special project that she has created called the Israel Healing Initiative. And this is a very significant project where she is putting together a group of trauma psychotherapists to go over with equipment to Israel to help people heal from trauma, and also bringing together psychotherapists in the United States who can offer telehealth support to Israelis as well. So we'll be back after this break. Stay with us and we'll learn more about what's happening with trauma throughout the world. You are listening to Go to Health Media. To reach Jonathan Marks or his guest expert, you may send an email to jonathanmarks@gotohealthmedia.com. You may also visit and subscribe to the website and show at gotohealthmedia.com. And now, back to this week's show.